I've been stationed at Yellowstone National Park for 6 years now, and I've seen just about everything this place has to offer. Grizzlies, wolves, avalanches, and even the odd tourist who thinks it's a good idea to pet a bison. But what I encountered 2 summers ago wasn't anything you'd find in the park manual, or any wildlife database for that matter. My name's Ben Aldridge, and this is the story I haven't told anyone, not even my closest colleagues. It started as a routine missing persons report. A solo hiker, mid-30s, hadn't returned to his car after a planned overnight trip along a backcountry trail near Lamar Valley. The area is vast and rugged, teeming with wildlife and dotted with geothermal springs, so it wasn't unheard of for someone to get lost out there. I was assigned to head out with another ranger, Lisa, to search the trail. We left early in the morning, the sunlight barely cresting the mountains. The air was cool, with that crisp smell of pine and damp earth. Lisa and I split up at the fork in the trail, with me taking the less traveled eastern route that wound deeper into the forest. We agreed to radio in every hour. The first few miles were uneventful, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional bird call. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing that overlooked a steep ravine. The view was breathtaking, golden meadows stretching into the distance, with a faint outline of bison herds grazing far below. But something felt off. The usual sounds of the forest were muted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then I saw it. A shredded piece of fabric snagged on a low branch. It was bright red, the same color as the missing hiker's jacket. My stomach tightened. I called Lisa on the radio, but all I got was static. I looked around for any sign of tracks, and that's when I noticed something strange. The ground was marked with deep gouges like claw marks, but they were far too large to belong to any predator I knew of. Each mark was spaced evenly apart, as if whatever made them had a massive stride. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to follow the gouges, figuring they might lead me to the hiker, or at least give me some clue as to what had happened. The trail led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like veins. The light dimmed, and the air grew colder, carrying a faint, sulfurous smell that made my nose wrinkle. After about an hour, I came upon a small, marshy clearing. In the center was a bubbling hot spring, its surface shimmering with rainbow hues. The claw marks ended abruptly at the edge of the spring. I scanned the area, and that's when I noticed something floating in the water. An unmistakable splash of red. It was the hiker's jacket, or what was left of it. The fabric was scorched around the edges, as if it had been exposed to intense heat. My radio crackled to life, and Lisa's voice came through faint and distorted. "Ben, you there? I found something weird. Trailhead." Her words cut off abruptly, replaced by static. I tried responding, but the signal was gone. Anxiety gnawed at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the area without a closer look would be a mistake. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the spring. That's when I heard it. A guttural growl, low and rumbling, like the sound of a distant landslide. My heart pounded as I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees. At first there was nothing, just the shadows shifting in the dim light. But then I saw movement. A tall, spindly figure emerging from the tree line, its body unnaturally thin yet impossibly strong-looking. Its skin was mottled and gray, glistening as if wet, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was an elongated, eyeless mass with a gaping mouth that pulsed with every breath. It moved toward me in jerky, unnatural strides, its long limbs bending at odd angles. The sulfuric stench grew stronger, nearly choking me, and I realized it was coming from the creature. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in quicksand. The creature let out a deafening screech, its head snapping toward me with a speed that made my stomach lurch. That broke my paralysis. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. Behind me I could hear the thing giving chase, its footsteps impossibly fast and heavy, like a drumbeat in the stillness. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I reached the trailhead, my lungs were on fire, and my legs felt like jelly. Lisa was there, pale and shaken, clutching a torn piece of paper in her hands. It looked like a page from a journal, with frantic handwriting scrawled across it. She shoved it at me without a word. The writing was almost illegible, but I could make out a few sentences. Watching me, can't sleep, not human, follows the heat. Don't go near the springs. We didn't speak much on the drive back to the station. Lisa's discovery and my encounter were enough to convince our supervisor to close off the trail indefinitely, citing unstable geothermal activity as the reason. We never found the missing hiker, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Sometimes I dream about that thing, its faceless head and jerky movements. I've convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I know better. Whatever it was, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of Yellowstone, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close. I've been a park ranger for almost a decade now, stationed in some of the most remote parts of the Rockies. My name's Jake McAllister, and I've seen my share of strange things in the wilderness. Unexplained lights, eerie animal calls, even hikers who swore they'd seen ghosts. But nothing prepared me for what happened in late September of 2019. It started with a call from the northwestern edge of the park, near a rarely used trailhead called Hollow Creek. A couple, seasoned hikers in their mid-40s, had reported a strange sound following them for miles. They said it wasn't an animal they could identify, and the husband swore it sounded almost human. It would start as a low hum, growing into a warped, garbled noise that echoed through the forest. By the time they reached their car, they said, the sound had stopped, but something felt wrong enough to report it. I was the closest ranger to Hollow Creek, so I was dispatched to check things out. The trail was a rugged, winding path that cut deep into the old-growth forest, far from any cell towers or emergency shelters. As I drove my Jeep down the dirt access road, the sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the trees. By the time I reached the trailhead, the air had that crisp, metallic bite that signaled the onset of autumn. The first mile of the trail was uneventful. The trees loomed high above me, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. I kept my radio on but didn't hear a peep. Around the 2-mile mark, I stopped to take a quick breather. That's when I heard it. A low, warbling hum, faint but unmistakable, carrying through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered. It had a strange rhythm, almost like breathing but distorted, as if played through an old tape recorder. I scanned the forest with my flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadows, but nothing moved. My hand instinctively went to the can of bear spray on my belt. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a little foolish. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the towering pines. The hum stopped. That was almost worse than the sound itself. An oppressive silence settled over the forest, the kind that makes your ears strain for even the faintest noise. I waited, heart thudding in my chest, but when nothing happened, I convinced myself it was some weird acoustics or maybe an animal I didn't recognize. I kept walking, though my steps were a little quicker now. About a half-mile further, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. In the middle of the trail was a pile of rocks, carefully stacked into a cairn. It wasn't unusual to see cairns marking trails, but this one was different. Each stone was jagged, like shards of broken slate, and arranged in a precarious, almost haphazard way that didn't look like it would hold. What's more, it was surrounded by a circle of small animal bones, rabbits, squirrels, maybe even birds. The bones were arranged in a way that looked deliberate, almost ceremonial. I crouched down, shining my flashlight over the pile. The stones were slick with something dark and wet. My brain refused to immediately process it, but when the smell hit me, coppery metallic, I knew it was blood. That's when the hum started again. This time it was louder, closer. It reverberated through my chest like the bass from a subwoofer, and I swear I felt the ground tremble beneath my boots. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight through the trees, but the beam seemed to dissolve into the darkness. The hum rose and fell in waves, warping into something almost like a chant. My throat went dry, and then I saw it. At first, It was just a shadow moving between the trees, almost imperceptible against the dim light. But as it drew closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something solid, tall and lanky, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied anatomy. Its skin was a mottled gray, blending eerily with the bark of the trees. And its head was wrong. Too small for its body, with eyes that glinted faintly like wet stones in the light. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't even move like a human. It seemed to flow between the trees, jerking and twitching in unnatural bursts of motion. The hum grew louder as it approached, and I realized it was coming from it, a vibration deep in its chest, almost like a grotesque purr. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The thing stepped into the beam of my flashlight, and for a moment, I thought I saw a mouth, a jagged, gaping maw that split its face in two. It opened, and the hum turned into a piercing screech that sent pain lancing through my skull. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the trail or the noise I was making. The screech followed me, echoing through the forest, and I could hear the thing moving behind me. Its steps were impossibly fast, erratic, like it was leaping from tree to tree. I don't remember how I made it back to the trailhead. The next thing I knew, I was in my Jeep, slamming the door and gunning the engine. The screech faded as I sped down the dirt road, but the hum lingered, faint and insidious, until I reached the ranger station. I reported what I'd seen, of course. The higher-ups chalked it up to stress, maybe dehydration, and told me to take a few days off. I didn't argue. I wasn't about to head back to Hollow Creek anytime soon. That was 4 years ago. I've since transferred to a different park, far from the Rockies. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that hum again, faint and distant, calling me back to the pines. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I've been a park ranger in Grand Echo National Park for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things, from hikers who got themselves stranded on cliffs to eerie noises in the woods late at night. But none of that ever shook me quite like what happened last spring. It started with a missing persons report. A seasoned hiker named Neil Avery had failed to check in with his wife after a weekend trek through the more remote areas of the park. His intended route was off the beaten path, weaving through dense pine forests and steep ravines, places where cell phone signals vanished and maps were more of a suggestion than a guide. I'd met Neil a few times over the years. He was the type who prided himself on navigating without GPS, relying solely on his compass and instincts. That's why his disappearance didn't sit right with me. We launched a search the next morning. The first couple of days turned up nothing unusual, just miles of unmarked trails, animal tracks, and the occasional rustle of undergrowth as deer darted away from our search party. But on the third day, I found something that made my stomach churn. I was combing through a grove of aspen trees when I noticed a scattering of gear near the base of a large boulder. A torn backpack, its contents strewn about, lay half buried in the dirt. Among the mess were a water bottle, a ripped map, and a pair of hiking boots, both still laced but oddly upright, as if someone had stepped out of them and vanished. What caught my attention most was the claw marks on the backpack. They were deep and deliberate, as if made by something with both strength and intent. Not a bear or cougar. I've seen the aftermath of their attacks, and this was different. I radioed the others and marked the location. As protocol dictated, we bagged the items and continued the search, but the mood had shifted. The other rangers were quiet, their eyes scanning the trees with a wariness that hadn't been there before. I'd like to say it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The forest felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. That night I stayed behind at the ranger station to log the day's findings. The station is a modest building with a single fluorescent light that hums just loud enough to be annoying. I was halfway through my report when I heard it, a low, guttural sound outside. It wasn't a coyote or an owl. It was deeper, resonating like a growl mixed with a wet, gurgling noise. I froze, the pen slipping from my fingers. Grabbing my flashlight and rifle, I stepped onto the porch. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness where even the stars seemed muted. I scanned the tree line, my breath visible in the cool night air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The only response was the creak of branches swaying in the wind. Just as I was about to retreat inside, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and too far apart to be human. They stared at me, unblinking, before vanishing into the shadows. My hands trembled as I locked the station door and double-checked the windows. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I decided to search the area near the station before the others arrived. I found footprints in the dirt, bare, elongated, and deeply pressed into the ground as if whatever made them was heavy. They led into the forest, disappearing into a thicket of bushes. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the forest felt. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. After about a mile, I came to a small clearing. In the center was a large tree with its bark stripped in long, jagged lines. At its base was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of bones, picked clean and arranged in a spiral pattern. Among them was a human skull. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. That's when I heard it again, that wet, gurgling growl, this time accompanied by the snap of twigs. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the trees, but I saw nothing. The growling grew louder, closer, and then I caught a glimpse of it. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its frame, and its face, if you could call it that, was a void of shifting shadows. It moved with unnatural speed, darting between the trees like smoke carried by the wind. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the station, but when I burst through the door, I locked it and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My radio crackled to life, a voice on the other end asking for my location. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The official report states that Neil Avery was never found, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. But I know the truth. Something else is out there in Grand Echo National Park, something that doesn't belong. I still patrol the park, but I avoid that part of the forest at all costs. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it, that low, gurgling growl, reminding me that the forest isn't always ours to roam. My name's Owen, and I've been a park ranger at Devil's Ridge National Park for 8 years. Nestled deep in the Rockies, the park is stunning during the day but unnervingly quiet at night. Over the years, I've heard my fair share of bizarre accounts from hikers and campers. Some chalk it up to overactive imaginations. Others leave me questioning my own. It was mid-September when I got the call. A solo camper, Jake Lewis, had been reported missing by his girlfriend. He'd planned a weekend hike to Devil's Ridge Summit, a trail infamous for its grueling switchbacks and breathtaking views. He was supposed to check in at the ranger station by noon Sunday. By the time we got word, it was Monday morning, and the forecast predicted a cold front rolling in. I grabbed my gear, thermal jacket, flashlight, first aid kit, and headed out with Tucker, my rescue dog. The trailhead was empty when we arrived, save for Jake's beat-up Jeep parked haphazardly along the lot. A light drizzle began to fall as we started our ascent, the dense forest swallowing what little sunlight broke through the clouds. The trail was well trodden at first, but around the 3rd mile, I spotted something unusual, deep gouges in the dirt, like someone had dragged a heavy rake through the mud. Tucker sniffed at the marks, his ears pinning back. That alone set me on edge. Tucker's trained to remain calm in emergencies. If he was spooked, something wasn't right. We pressed on, following the scratches as they veered off the main path and into the underbrush. The farther we went, the more the forest changed. The pines stood unnaturally still, their needles coated in a fine, sticky mist that clung to my gloves. The air was heavy, metallic almost like the tang of blood. I tried to rationalize it, some kind of mineral deposit nearby maybe. But deep down, I knew better. About a mile off the main trail, we found Jake's campsite. His orange tent was flattened, shredded from the top down. The fire pit had been overturned, ashes scattered across the clearing. I called out his name, my voice echoing eerily. Tucker whined, tugging at his leash toward a cluster of boulders a few yards away. That's when I saw the first sign of Jake, his backpack wedged between two rocks. It was torn open, contents spilling out. A water bottle, trail mix, a soaked map. Nearby, a single boot lay half buried in the mud, its laces snapped. No blood, though, no tracks, just nothing. The storm was closing in fast, so I radioed back to the station for backup. Static crackled through the speaker, but I managed to get through. Possible code 14, I said. A missing person. They told me reinforcements wouldn't arrive until morning. Fantastic. I debated staying put until I noticed something odd. Around the campsite, the forest floor was littered with broken branches and pine cones, but there was no sign of animal activity. No birds chirping, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to die as the sun dipped below the ridge. And then I heard it. A low, guttural groan, like the creak of an old tree but deeper, almost vocal. It came from somewhere up the ridge. Tucker growled, his fur bristling as he faced the darkness. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, to wait for backup, but I couldn't shake the thought of Jake out there, injured and alone. We climbed cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The sound came again, closer this time, a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the brush. I froze, sweeping the light in an arc. That's when I saw it. Two pinpricks of light reflected back at me from the shadows, too high to be an animal and too far apart to be human. They blinked once, twice, then disappeared as whatever it was ducked behind a tree. "Jake," I called, my voice trembling. No response. Just that awful wet sound moving away. Tucker barked sharply, breaking the silence. He lunged forward, nearly yanking the leash from my hand. I caught a glimpse of a massive, hunched silhouette slinking through the trees, its limbs grotesquely long, its gait jerky and unnatural. We gave chase, adrenaline drowning out my fear. The ground was treacherous, the rocky incline slick with rain. Tucker led the way, his nose to the ground, until we reached a small cave carved into the mountainside. The smell hit me first. Rot and decay, like a meat locker left to spoil. Inside, the beam of my flashlight revealed a scene I'll never forget. Jake was there, or what was left of him. His body was crumpled near the back of the cave, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Deep claw marks raked across his chest, his blood pooling dark and viscous beneath him. And then I heard it again. The groan, reverberating from deeper within the cave. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I turned. It was there. The creature stood hunched, its mottled gray skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Its head was too small for its body, its mouth a grotesque slit that split open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. But it was the eyes that stopped me cold. Cold, unblinking orbs that seemed to pierce right through me. Tucker snarled, but he was no match for the thing. It lunged, moving faster than something that size should be able to. I stumbled backward, barely managing to pull my gun. The shot echoed deafeningly in the cave, and the creature let out a shriek that rattled my teeth. It retreated, scuttling into the shadows like an oversized spider. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. Grabbing Tucker's leash, I bolted, my heart hammering as we tore down the trail. The rain had turned into a full-on downpour, masking any sounds of pursuit. We didn't stop until we reached the station, soaked and shaking. Jake's body was recovered the next day, but the official report listed his death as a bear attack. I didn't argue. Whatever I saw that night wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. Since then, I've avoided Devil's Ridge at night. But sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that groan echoing through the mountains, reminding me that some trails are better left unexplored. My name is Daniel Ortiz, and I've been a park ranger at Clearwater National Forest for almost a decade. It's a job that demands resilience, mentally and physically. But I've always taken pride in my work. At least I used to. Until last summer. That was when everything changed. It started with a routine call from a group of campers who reported strange noises coming from the woods around their site. My colleague Melissa and I were on night patrol, so we decided to check it out. Night complaints are common. Usually raccoons, sometimes the occasional black bear. But when we reached the campground, I knew something was off. The air was heavy. Not in the usual humid way Clearwater could get after a rainstorm, but stifling, oppressive, like stepping into a room where someone's been screaming for hours. The group of campers, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, stood huddled by the campfire. The father, a wiry man named Carl, looked pale under the flickering light. It's in the trees," he said, voice cracking. "We heard it circling us. Low growls. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard." I glanced at Melissa. She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but we both knew the drill. Investigate, reassure the visitors, and make sure everyone felt safe. "Probably just a coyote," I said, offering what I hoped was a calming smile. "They can sound pretty eerie at night." Carl shook his head vehemently. This wasn't a coyote. It sounded wrong. Almost like it was trying to mimic a coyote, but it didn't know how. His words sent an unexpected shiver down my spine, but I dismissed it. The job had taught me to temper my imagination. We assured them we'd patrol the area and advised them to keep their fire lit. As we moved away from the campsite, the forest swallowed us in its dark embrace. Our flashlights barely pierced the blackness, but the faint crunch of pine needles underfoot was oddly reassuring. For a while, we heard nothing. The forest was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our boots and our breathing. "Too quiet," Melissa muttered. She never scared easily, but I noticed her hand resting on the grip of her sidearm. We walked another quarter-mile before I noticed something strange. Claw marks gouged into a tree trunk, deep and deliberate. They were spaced too far apart to be a bear, and they ran in an odd, almost deliberate pattern, like symbols. "You seeing this?" I whispered. Melissa nodded, her flashlight tracing the grooves. "Bear couldn't have done that." Before we could process it, a low guttural sound cut through the silence. It wasn't quite a growl. It was deeper, almost mechanical, like the sound of rocks grinding together, layered with something wet and organic. My heart raced as Melissa and I turned toward the source. The beam of my flashlight caught movement, something slipping between the trees. At first glance, it looked like a deer, but its legs were too long, too angular, and its movements were unnaturally smooth, like a marionette being dragged by invisible strings. "Did you see that?" Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. I nodded, gripping my flashlight tighter. We didn't speak, didn't dare to as we crept closer. The undergrowth felt like it was clawing at my legs, and every step seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Then we saw it. It stood at the edge of a clearing, half obscured by shadow. At first, my mind tried to rationalize it. A malformed elk, maybe. But the longer I stared, the more my brain rebelled. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its frame, ribcage visibly heaving with shallow breaths. The head was wrong, elongated with wide, lidless eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. And then it looked at us. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But Melissa gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound that sent the thing lurching toward us. "Run!" she shouted, and we bolted. The forest erupted in chaos around us, branches snapping and leaves rustling as the thing gave chase. Its movements were unnatural, almost insect-like, with bursts of impossible speed. My lungs burned as we weaved through the trees, the beams of our flashlights bouncing wildly. We burst into the camper's sight, breathless and wild-eyed. Carl and his family stared at us in confusion and fear. "Get in your car! Now!" Melissa barked. They didn't need to be told twice. As the engine roared to life, Melissa and I turned to face the woods, weapons drawn. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness, the thing emerged. It was taller now, almost humanoid, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it emitted a sound I can only describe as laughter, a guttural, choking imitation of human laughter. I fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the forest, and the thing recoiled, its form flickering like a mirage. Then it disappeared, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there. The rest of the night was a blur. We escorted the family to the ranger station and filed a report, though we both knew it would be buried under unexplained phenomena. Melissa and I agreed never to speak of it again, but I can tell it's haunted her as much as it's haunted me. Every so often I find myself staring at those claw marks, wondering what we really saw that night, wondering if it's still out there, and praying it isn't. My name is Carter Reeves, and I've been a park ranger stationed at Blackwood Gorge for 7 years. It's the kind of place that's both breathtakingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. Towering pines stretch so high they block out the sun, and the fog rolls in so thick that it swallows sound. I've always thought of the gorge as alive, not just in the way nature is, but as if it's aware of you, watching. Still, it wasn't until last summer that I truly understood just how alive it might be. It started with an unusual number of reports from hikers. Over the span of 2 weeks, people kept coming into the visitor center, pale and shaken, claiming they'd seen something. Descriptions varied: a shadow moving through the trees, a pair of glowing eyes in the mist, or even a figure standing motionless at the edge of the cliffs. Most of the sightings were concentrated around an area called Raven's Hollow, a deep, narrow valley that cuts through the gorge. It's a place that already has a reputation for unsettling vibes, even among us rangers. I was tasked with investigating the area one afternoon. Armed with my flashlight, radio, and a growing sense of unease, I made my way down the overgrown trail that led into Raven's Hollow. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own boots crunching on the gravel path. By the time I reached the valley floor, the fog had thickened, clinging to the trees like a living thing. About an hour into my patrol, I found something odd. There were claw marks on one of the larger pines, deep gouges that ran from the base to nearly 10 feet up. They were too large to belong to any bear or mountain lion in the area. Stranger still, there was no other sign of wildlife. No scat, no tracks, nothing to indicate that any animal had passed through recently. Just those claw marks, as if something had scaled the tree with terrifying strength. I radioed in my findings to the station and continued deeper into the hollow. That's when I saw it. A figure standing about 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by the fog. At first I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. "Hey," I called out. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't move. I took a few steps closer, and that's when my flashlight caught it fully. It wasn't a person. It was something else. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, but its limbs were too long, its proportions all wrong. Its skin was blacker than the shadows around it, as if it absorbed the light entirely. And its eyes, they weren't glowing as the hikers had described. Instead, they were empty voids, darker than the rest of its form. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing tilted its head slightly as if studying me. Then, without a sound, it moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided, faster than anything I've ever seen, disappearing into the mist. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my flashlight trembling in my hand before I found the courage to move again. I followed the trail back to the ranger station as quickly as I could, every hair on my neck standing on end. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its featureless face and unnaturally long limbs burned into my mind. I considered filing a report but decided against it. Who would believe me? Instead, I resolved to keep an eye on the area, hoping that the sightings would stop on their own. They didn't. Over the next few days, more hikers came forward with stories, each one eerily similar to mine. A shadow in the fog, eyes that seemed to bore into your soul, a sensation of being followed but finding nothing when you turned around. One couple even claimed they heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, coming from the trees. The final straw came when a young woman went missing. Her name was Emily Harper, a solo backpacker who'd been trekking through Blackwood Gorge for a week. Her last known location was, of course, Raven's Hollow. We launched a search party immediately, combing every inch of the valley, but there was no trace of her, no gear, no footprints, nothing. It was as if she had been swallowed whole. 3 days later, I found her, or at least I found what was left of her. It was early morning and the fog was so dense I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I was retracing my steps from the previous search when I stumbled upon a clearing I hadn't noticed before. In the center was a large, flat rock covered in moss. Lying on top of it was Emily's backpack, neatly placed as if on display. Next to it was her hat, her journal, and a single hiking boot. And then I saw the blood. It was smeared across the rock in long, jagged streaks, dripping onto the ground below. My stomach turned as I realized that the streaks formed a pattern, a crude spiral, almost ritualistic in its design. The claw marks I'd seen earlier now made a sickening amount of sense. I didn't linger. I radioed in my location and waited for the others to arrive, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. When they did, their reactions mirrored my own. Horror, disbelief, and an unspoken agreement that whatever did this wasn't natural. The official report lists Emily Harper's death as an animal attack, but none of us believe that. Something lives in Raven's Hollow, something older and darker than any of us can comprehend. I haven't been back there since, and I've warned every hiker I've met to avoid the area. Most of them laugh it off, calling it a ranger's attempt at a ghost story. But it's not a story. It's a warning. And if you ever find yourself in Blackwood Gorge, remember this. When the forest grows silent and the fog begins to thicken, don't look too closely at the shadows, because one of them might be looking back. My name is Emma, and I've been a ranger stationed at Blackwater Hollow for nearly 6 years. It's a vast stretch of wilderness tucked away in northern Montana, where sprawling pine forests cradle mirror-like lakes. Beautiful, sure, but it has a reputation among us rangers. Blackwater doesn't like to give people back. Hikers get lost here all the time, more than any other part of the park. Most are found within a day or two, cold, dehydrated, but alive. But every now and then, someone vanishes without a trace. No belongings, no footprints, just gone. I never thought much of it until the night I saw what's been taking them. It started with a routine call. A couple of campers reported strange noises near their site on the western edge of the hollow. Scraping sounds, low growls, twigs snapping in patterns too deliberate to be the wind. I grabbed my pack and set off, figuring it was a bear or maybe a mountain lion. Predators usually keep their distance, but every so often one gets bold. When I arrived, the campers were long gone. Their tent was still pitched, half-zipped, with their belongings scattered across the clearing. A cooler lay on its side, its lid pried open and its contents spilled out. Odd. Bears don't usually leave food untouched, but nothing was missing. I radioed the station, requesting backup. "Unlikely bear activity," I said, keeping my voice steady. The response crackled back. "ETA 2 hours, hold tight." That's when I noticed the prints, massive clawed depressions in the soft earth. They weren't bear tracks, too long, too narrow. Whatever made them walked on 2 legs. A shiver ran up my spine, but I told myself it was just a large bear with an unusual gait. Denial is comforting like that. I decided to scout the area while I waited. With my flashlight cutting through the gloom, I followed the tracks into the trees. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of crickets and owls eerily absent. My own footsteps sounded deafening on the mossy ground. The deeper I went, the stranger the tracks became. They started to overlap like whatever made them was pacing in circles. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a piece of fabric caught on a low branch. It was torn, stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. My stomach tightened. One of the campers, or someone else entirely? I was about to turn back when I heard it. A guttural clicking noise, like stones being tapped together, but wetter. The sound came from somewhere up ahead beyond the beam of my flashlight. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Instead, I crept forward, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The noise grew louder, accompanied by a faint metallic smell that burned my nostrils. I crouched behind a fallen log, peering into a small clearing just beyond the trees. And there it was. The thing stood about 7 feet tall, its elongated limbs covered in matted black fur that seemed to shimmer when it moved. Its head was wrong, elongated and eyeless, with a wide, lipless mouth filled with jagged teeth. It crouched over something, its claws scraping rhythmically against the surface of a boulder, as if sharpening them. Then I saw what it was crouched over, a torn sleeping bag, its contents spilling out. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just gear. The fabric was soaked with blood, fresh and glistening in the moonlight. The metallic stench suddenly made sense. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, a shift in my stance, because the creature snapped its head in my direction. Though it had no eyes, I felt it looking at me, its gaze heavy and suffocating. It tilted its head, the clicking noise growing louder, more erratic. I ran. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I sprinted through the forest. My flashlight bounced wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of the trees around me. The clicking followed, impossibly close. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just chasing, it was hunting. The ground suddenly disappeared beneath me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, landing hard on my side. Pain shot through my ribs, but I scrambled to my feet, scanning the darkness for movement. The clicking had stopped. The silence was worse. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers trembling. "This is Ranger Emma," I gasped, trying to keep my voice steady. "Possible 1057, need immediate evac." Static. Then faintly, "Copy, Emma. Hold your position. We're on our way." Hold my position? Easier said than done. The creature stepped into view at the top of the embankment, silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the canopy. It moved slowly, deliberately, its claws clicking against the rocks as it descended toward me. I backed away, my hand brushing against a fallen branch. Gripping it tightly, I swung as hard as I could when the creature lunged. The branch splintered on impact, barely phasing the thing. It let out a guttural roar that shook me to my core. Desperate, I grabbed my flare gun and fired. The flare struck its chest, exploding in a burst of red light. The creature shrieked, its body convulsing as the flames licked at its fur. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing near the edge of Blackwater Lake. The rescue team found me an hour later, curled up and clutching the empty flare gun like a lifeline. I filed my report the next day. Official cause of the camper's disappearance: animal attack. Unofficially, I know better. I've seen predators, natural and otherwise. This thing, it wasn't from here, wasn't from anywhere that should exist. I don't patrol Blackwater Hollow anymore. Someone else can take their chances. But on quiet nights, when the wind carries just right, I swear I can still hear that clicking, echoing from the forest like a terrible promise. I'm Officer Jake Bennett, and I've spent most of my career as a ranger assigned to Whispering Canyon National Park in Utah. It's a stunning place, a sprawling labyrinth of sandstone cliffs and dense forests. People come here to escape the chaos of modern life, to connect with nature, but they don't always understand what they're stepping into. Whispering Canyon earned its name for the strange winds that sweep through the cliffs. They make sounds, soft murmurs, almost like voices. Old folklore says the whispers are the spirits of those who died here, warning visitors to tread lightly. I always thought it was just a spooky tale to entertain campers. Until last fall. It was late October, the off-season. Fewer visitors meant quieter days, but it also meant we were short-staffed. I was patrolling a trail near Black Hollow, a remote area rarely visited except by hardcore hikers. The sun was dipping low, painting the canyon in fiery hues, and I was planning to head back to the station when a call came through on my radio. "Ranger Bennett, we've got a missing hiker reported in Black Hollow. Last seen entering the trailhead around noon. Name's Natalie Sloan, 28, wearing a red jacket and black hiking boots. Great. A missing hiker at sunset. I acknowledged the call, grabbed my pack, and started up the trail. The air grew colder as the light faded, the shadows stretching into eerie shapes. My boots crunched on the dry dirt, the sound oddly loud in the oppressive silence. Even the whispers seemed muted, as if the canyon was holding its breath. After an hour of searching, I found her pack near a steep drop-off. The strap was torn as if it had been snagged on something, but there was no sign of Natalie. I called out her name, my voice echoing off the cliffs, but there was no response. As I scanned the area, I noticed something strange. Claw marks etched into the rock face. They were deep and jagged, running parallel like something massive had dragged its claws across the stone. A chill ran down my spine. Bears didn't leave marks like that. I was about to radio for backup when I heard it, a faint melodic humming. It didn't sound human, yet it wasn't entirely unnatural either. It was coming from deeper in the canyon. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The humming led me to a narrow crevice between two cliffs, barely wide enough to squeeze through. On the other side, the trail opened into a small clearing bathed in pale moonlight. That's where I saw her. Natalie was sitting on the ground, her back to me, still in her red jacket. Relief flooded through me. "Natalie!" I called out, stepping closer. She didn't respond. Something was off. Her posture was too rigid, her head tilted slightly to the side as if listening to something only she could hear. I stepped closer, the crunch of my boots echoing in the clearing. "Miss Sloan, are you hurt?" That's when she turned her head. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring at nothing. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was the same melodic humming, eerily perfect, like she was harmonizing with something I couldn't hear. Then I saw it. Something moved in the shadows behind her, a shape too tall and too thin to be human. Its limbs were elongated, the skin stretched tight over its frame. Its head was crowned with twisted antler-like protrusions, and its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, like embers burning in the dark. The thing reached for her, its clawed hand hovering inches above her head. "Hey!" I shouted, raising my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a brief moment I saw its face. It didn't have one. Just a smooth expanse of pale skin where eyes, nose, and a mouth should have been. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a low guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through my chest. Natalie collapsed as the thing melted back into the shadows. I rushed to her side, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, and she stared at me in confusion. "What? Where am I?" "You're safe now," I lied, glancing nervously at the tree line. We didn't linger. I practically carried her back to the trailhead, every crunch of leaves and snap of twigs setting my nerves on edge. Back at the station, Natalie had no memory of what happened. She claimed she got lost and must have fainted, but I could tell she didn't believe her own story. She avoided my eyes when I asked about the humming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, staring into the dark forest beyond the ranger station. And then I heard it, the same melodic humming carried on the wind. Whispering Canyon isn't just a place of beauty, it's a place of watchers, of things that have lived in the shadows long before we ever set foot here. And they don't like being disturbed.